Performance. Another round of applause, everybody. How many of us have really enjoyed science in school? Only when you're in lab, when things explode in the chemistry lab or things change color. Today we have with us Mr. Ramji Raghavan, who is actually heading an organization that does exactly that for children. Agastya Foundation runs the world's largest mobile hands-on science education program for the economically disadvantaged children and rural teachers. Nearly 5 million disadvantaged children and over 150,000 teachers in rural India have been benefited from Agastya Foundation. Mr. Raghavan is the founder and chairman of Agastya International Foundation, and he leads a grassroots initiative to support and transform primary and secondary education in India. Operating with a fleet of 62 mobile labs, 29 rural science centers, and a 172-acre creativity lab campus near Bangalore, Mr. Raghavan was a member of the Prime Minister's National Knowledge Commission. He is a member of the board of Vigyan Prasar, Delhi, and Executive Committee of the Visvesvaraya Industrial and Technological Museum and the Karnataka State Innovation Council. It is a privilege and honor to invite him on stage to deliver the keynote address.
Thank you very much. All I can say is I've been extremely impressed and inspired by what I've seen and heard today. And the skit in particular and the dance performance has filled me with energy. So I'll try and do my best to fill you with some energy if I can through my talk for the next 10-15 minutes. You know, immediately after the war, the famous war of the Mahabharata, as you all know, the Pandavas were the victors. Yudhishthira had a ceremony where he was going to be declared the Chakravartin of India. And the protocol involved that he would offer a lot of Brahmins all the gold and land and everything else at his possession as part of the ceremony. And the Brahmins would say, no, no, we don't want all that. And Krishna was there, so was Vyasa, and of course Arjuna, and all the other kings from all over India. And they were amazed at Yudhishthira's generosity. He offered more and more things, gold, land, you name it. And the Brahmins said, no, 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 we don't want anything. All we want is a little bit of gold. And he smiled and said, okay. And everyone was commenting on his generosity when a mongoose came by. And it was rather a strange-looking mongoose because it had blue-grey eyes and half its skin, the pelt, was golden in color. The other half was the color of a mongoose. And the mongoose spoke to Yudhishthira and said, Yudhishthira, you're a great king, and you think this is the most generous act, don't you, that anyone has committed in India? And Yudhishthira kept quiet, and Krishna smiled, and so did Vyasa, and the mongoose said, Yudhishthira, this is nothing, nothing, compared to the generosity of the poor farmer. And he went on to tell the story of the poor farmer, who had owned about 2 or 3 acres of land, and was hit by a terrible drought in the region. So literally, the farmer began to starve, and his wife and son and daughter-in-law were also at the point of starvation. So he went around with a begging bowl, looking for food. And finally, at the end of one harrowing day, he came back with a bowl full of gruel, a kind of porridge. And he brought it home and immediately put it in 4 parts. And the family sat down desperately to eat because they hadn't eaten for days on end, when there was a knock, just as he was going to put his spoon in his mouth. And in came a man and he said, oh farmer, I've been starving, I haven't eaten any food. Please save me, give me food. And without hesitation, the farmer offered him his bowl. And the guy finished it off in a nanosecond and said, I'm still hungry. This isn't enough. So the farmer's son looked at him and said, "Father, don't worry. I'm with you in spirit and in reality." And he offered his bull. And that was also finished off in less than a second. So the farmer didn't know what to do, and his wife looked at him and said, "Don't worry, husband. You know, I know what hospitality is all about, and you've taught me that, so here's my bowl." And the man finished that bowl as well. And he said, "I'm still hungry." And the farmer didn't have the heart to look at his daughter-in-law. And she said, "Father, please don't be embarrassed. The least I can do is to offer my food to the visitor." And so the visitor finished off the last bowl of gruel. And this mongoose was standing there in a corner. It was walking by and it watched this fascinating thing happening. And of course, we all know that the farmer and his family would die. So the man suddenly stood up and said, "Oh, poor farmer, I've never seen such an act of generosity on earth. For this, you will be rewarded." And there was a shaft of light that covered the entire house. And he said, "For this, you and your family will be taken to heaven." The mongoose, which happened to be standing in a corner, half its body was covered with the light, it turned to gold. And the other half was in the dark, so it stayed as it was. So the mongoose looked at Yudhishthira and said, "I'm still looking for an act of generosity to meet that standard that the poor farmer said, because I'd like to see my entire coat turn to gold." Now, a beautiful story where somebody shared the last bits of food he had at the point of starvation with a perfect stranger. And food here, I think, represents many things, whether it's time, your knowledge, your money, your love, your company, whatever. That spirit of sharing and generosity is what creates a civilization, a society. It doesn't matter what it is, but if that spirit is there, then it gives hope. It brings about change automatically. And like anything, if you want to get good at something, you've got to practice it. So my own experience is practice the feeling of being generous and see what happens. Be aware and see what happens to you and to society around you. So when I was a banker about 15 years ago, I wasn't a terribly generous guy. And I guess you'd think that's probably true of most bankers. And I was living in London. And I had this dream when I was a kid that I would build a school for creative leaders in the Himalayas. So I was nearing 40, a sort of very important point, I suppose, in one's life. And I said, "Look, Ramji, if you want to build a school, you probably have to do it now, because it'll take time and a lot of energy to do it." And I have a friend in London, Mr. Warrior, with whom I used to have some very meaning of life type discussions, talking about, you know, what was the purpose of life and money and power and all the rest of it, relationships. And one day he said, "You know, Ramji, I've known you for the last 30 years. And I think you're leading a very selfish life, making money from money. You really are not connected to the wider society around you." And that was true. And I said, no, I don't think that's true. I think I've been fairly fair and good to my family and so on and so forth, given a little bit of money to various causes. And he said, "Look, fundamentally you're a selfish guy. And you've got to try and understand that." So he told me a story. He said, "You went to school in Rishi Valley, so I'll tell you a story that you told me 30 years ago about the founder of Rishi Valley, J. Krishnamurti." So Krishnamurti was walking towards a village near Rishi Valley one day, and he saw an old woman, a very frail old woman, carrying a headload of firewood. And Krishnamurti went up to her and said, "Let me help you carry this firewood." And she said no, because in that part of the country they almost treated him like a god. But he insisted on carrying it for her all the way to her village, left it at her home. So Gopi looked at me and said, "Do you know why he did it?" And I said, "Yes, I think I know why he did it. But if I tell you, you'll say you're speaking from here." Not from here. So tell me, why did he do it? And Gopi said, because he felt her pain. The problem with you, old boy, is that you don't feel the other person's pain. It was a rather harsh message given to me at a time of transition, but I must confess I realized it was true. And I literally walked home that evening with sagging shoulders, feeling miserable about the truth of what he said, and obviously I didn't sleep very well that night. That was 1998, but I guess it turned out to be one of the defining moments in my life. And the year when India blasted, as you might recall, 5 nuclear bombs. My father was visiting London and he said, look, Ramji, you want to build a school, you want to teach science or whatever. The fact is, neither you nor I is an educator or a scientist. So let's consult P.K. Iyengar, who had retired as the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and get his views on what you want to do. So I went to India and sat down with Iyengar and other scientists and educators and college students and school students, and we brainstormed. And we asked questions like, what is creativity? What's the basis of creative thinking? And we came up with a model. We said, look, a lot of creative people tend to be very good observers. They tend to see a lot more than the average person does. There's a process of awareness in the brain. There's the capacity to assimilate and integrate, associate different strands of information to produce something new and different. And finally, there's the ability to apply all of this to produce something, whether it's an idea or a product or a service or whatever. Now, all of this rests on the foundation of curiosity. If you're curious, then it's likely you'll be more observant, more aware, have the capacity to assimilate and apply things. So we said, if you want to produce creative people or encourage creativity, what you need to do first is to spark curiosity. So the mission of our foundation will be to spark curiosity. And we had different perspectives. A young college girl from Bangalore said, you know, I went through school and I can't remember a single thing that I learned at school, except this project where I built an African village. And we came up with a pattern. We said, look, people tend to retain things where they were personally engaged, where there's been some experience, hands-on involvement. So if we're going to spark curiosity and eventually creativity, let's do it through hands-on experiential learning. And the fact that cognitive scientists later did a study, or earlier had done a study, which showed that the average human brain retains 5% of a lecture, but more than 70% of a discussion and 80% of what's personally experienced, and over 90% of what you teach to others, kind of was consistent with what we had come up with ground up through our own discussions. The second thing we said is, look, lots of people are building schools, and we can't really compete with them. In fact, I wasn't a school principal, nor an educator. So perhaps what we should do is find ways and means of disseminating this creative, curious spirit across the masses of India. And Iyengar talked about how the scientific establishment of India had been created. And that was fantastic, except there was a huge chasm now between those that were well-educated and trained people like yourselves and a large mass in the country. So our sense was, can we bridge this gap that was diverging all the time in terms of knowledge and learning? So we said, look, rather than build a school, let's try and raise the speed limit of creativity across India. To use an analogy, we said, let's try and raise the level of the ocean, even by a millimeter. That would be more meaningful than filling a bucket. So the first thing we did was to buy a piece of land in Kuppam, not very far from here, on the border with Karnataka, a barren piece of earth, and we said we'll create our dream institution there. Now that was the good news, we got the land. The bad news was we ran out of money. So we did what we were good at. We huddled again and brainstormed and said, what are we going to do? And somebody said, look, while we wait for the money to build the buildings to attract children and teachers to our dream campus, let's take education out to the villages. How? How about a mobile lab? So a friend of mine in an auto company loaned us a second-hand vehicle. An institute in Mumbai, the Homi Bhabha Center, gifted us a trunk full of low-cost science experiments made of things like coat hangers and Bisleri bottles and pieces of string and cotton wool and even potatoes and stuff. And we trained our tractor driver, Balram, on campus to be the first mobile lab instructor and set him loose in the villages. A few weeks went by and I asked Balram, how's it going? And he said, excellent, the kids love it. At first they would run away, thinking I was a missionary. But then they came running back when they saw this little trunk full of experiments. And they got very engaged and participated. And they asked a lot of questions. And he said, you know what? I didn't realize that teaching could be so much fun. I love it. So I said, great, I'm glad you love it. Because there's no other job for you right now. Just keep doing this till we come up with more money or a better idea. And the mobile lab became the vehicle for another project at scale, the Village Science Fair. And I remember this particular fair where we were expecting about 500 children to come, and we had trained about 20, 30 teachers to teach these experiments. And instead we were told, to our horror, to expect about 5,000 kids. The good news was there was a lot of enthusiasm. The bad news, well, we didn't know how we would handle the 10 times magnified crowd. So a couple of young girls came up to us, Muslim girls, and said, look, you seem to be in a bit of a pickle. You don't have enough teachers. How about if you trained us to teach these experiments? So we got a bunch of 14-year and 15-year-olds, about 100 of them, and trained them very quickly. And they became the instructors. And we launched the fair, which was a huge success. Not least because these kids who came were surprised and astonished to see not grey-haired sort of people like me with sullen expressions going to teach them science in a very forbidding way, but other children just like themselves. And this led to what we call our Young Instructor Leader program, which I believe is one of the most transformative programs that we've come up with, and one of the largest of its kind in India, if not the world. So what the mobile lab and the science fairs did, they helped us over time to evolve what we call our hub and spoke strategy, which is we go to a district and set up a satellite science center with a couple of hundred hands-on science experiments, which acts like a hub for the local area, and then the mobile labs span out to remote areas and they're the spokes. So we've done this now in about 20-odd districts in Karnataka, and we're in 9 other states in India. And it's become our dissemination distribution system for a lot of new ideas, models, exhibits, learning methods and tools that we come up with on our campus in Kuppam. So what these battlefield innovations have taught me over the years is that the old saying, abundance sometimes makes you poor, is very true. The less you have, the more inventive you become, because you're forced to be inventive. You know, people even refer to it as the death ground strategy. Imagine you're just about to die, unless you act, and what would you do? And it's surprising what an individual would do to survive and prosper in life. So we've learned a lot of stuff through failure, through experimentation, by being very proactive, by exploring to try and find out, and not worrying too much all the time about the consequences or the outcomes. Because the other thing I've learned in this process is that don't get too hung up on outcomes. Am I really going to change the world? It's probably the wrong question to ask. The point is, can you have fun engaging in a way in society that's relatively unselfish? Not because you're trying to be moral, but because as you do this and watch yourself, you find yourself changing and growing as an individual. You realize that there's a lot more to life than just greed and accumulation and self-preservation. So it's a journey, it's a process of discovery. And as you do this, you realize that outcomes are only temporary and transitory. You know, very often we go and visit children. There was this girl, Uma, and I asked her one day, what's the impact that Agastya Foundation has had? And she said, not that she hadn't learned science better, but she didn't say that. She didn't say, I've learned a lot of physics or chemistry or biology and I'm topping the class. You know what she said? She said, I'm not afraid to speak anymore. Now, that was a change that I didn't expect. And that was not just education, that was transformation. So the other learning that perhaps you can take from this as you interact with children and adults and so on, is that don't underestimate the impact of what you're doing. You might think you're teaching somebody to learn math, and that might well happen, but the actual jewel might well be a transformation in the self-belief of that child or the individual. And once your self-belief is transformed, then you can change yourself. You can make a lot of impact. So a lot of outcomes are indirect because life is very complex. So focus on the process and don't worry too much about the outcome. The other learning that perhaps would be of relevance to you is go where no one's gone before. We set up our campus in Kuppam in the middle of nowhere, and I'd invite all of you to visit it. Rather than do something in Bangalore where the intellectual capital resides, we went to a place where there was literally no intellectual capital and created a magnet for intellectual capital. A lot of people from around the world now visit our campus and across India. So doing what the opposite of what conventional wisdom tells you very often, not always, because there are risks, very often leads to a breakthrough. In fact, I often tell my daughter that, and perhaps I'm doing this at my own cost, that if too many people are advising you to do something, just do the opposite of what they tell you. And you might be surprised. You might be surprised. People will come and say, wow, that was brilliant. You must be a genius. How did you do it? Well, actually, there wasn't any genius in it. You just said, everyone's saying do this. What's the opposite of that? I'll do that. So sometimes do the opposite of what people tell you to do. I don't want to annoy any parents here who are trying to mold their children and get them, to do well in school and college and so on. But that's something that I've learned. The next thing is hire people. Look for people with a BEE degree. Now raise your hand if you have a BEE degree, and even if you raised it, I can barely see you. But anyway, raise it to yourself, and that's more important. And BEEs doesn't stand for Bachelor of Electrical Engineering or Ecology and Environment, all terribly important degrees. It stands for Bachelor of Energy and Enthusiasm. Okay? So with energy and enthusiasm, with a BEE degree in your pocket, you can change yourself, and if you believe your role is to change the world, then perhaps you might even achieve that. But I guarantee you something. Your spirit will be infectious. Your spirit will be inspiring. Your spirit will be generous. Your spirit will be worth emulating. And you'll feel the flow, the current of energy, enthusiasm, and passion flow through you. And there's no high that's higher than that. Right? So hire people with a BEE degree. In fact, in Agastya, we now offer degrees, BEE degrees to our staff. But I was told the bureaucracy won't allow you to call it a Bachelor of Energy and Enthusiasm. So we call it brimming with energy and enthusiasm. Right? I've already talked about don't get too hung up on the outcomes, focus on the process. The last point is act. Action is hugely liberating. Yes, it's important to think and to analyze. After all, we have a cognitive mind that has the capacity to do that. And you need to build skills, very important skills, to think through, analyze, find gaps that you can fill, and so on. Understand the risks of your actions. But ultimately, if you want to learn how to swim, you've got to dive into the pool. If you want to be a great batsman or you want to play cricket, you've got to pick up the bat and try and hit the ball. So action is the most important thing. Now, I have to say that particularly in India, we have a relatively low bias for action, unless it's some action that's driven by an immediate need. So if you can act, just do whatever it is, you're going to attract a lot of attention. You're going to attract a lot of support. One of the things I found in Agastya Foundation, and I'm not a scientist, and I've learned very little science since we started the foundation, is that people come to us and say, you know, Dr. Atre, the former scientific advisor to the Minister of Defense, who's one of our trustees, told me the other day, the reason Agastya has been successful is because it hasn't been led by a scientist. Right? He said, and he's a scientist, he said it's been led by non-scientists. Because the important thing is not the science. We can get people to advise us and give us all the ideas. There are enough people to do that. If you can network, and that's a different skill. But if you can act, try out things, create a platform like Venkatesh was saying, then nothing like it. That is what India needs. India needs action. India doesn't need too many new ideas. There are enough ideas here. There are enough ideas. Now your idea may not be the best, but who knows? It may be the best. Or even if it isn't the best, it doesn't matter. Just act and make it happen. And when you do that, you attract a lot of support and energy. So let me end my talk by saying it's been absolutely a revelation for me to come here and see the wonderful work that Youth for Seva is doing. Venkatesh and I have talked about how at Agastya we can become more effective in attracting volunteers. And I must say, barring about 50 or 100 volunteers, we haven't been particularly good at knowing how to use volunteers effectively. But I think we're going to act and turn that around and make it a strength after consulting with Venkatesh and all the rest of you. So thank you very much. Keep up the fantastic work that you're doing. Keep it up. Don't worry about impact. You're already having impact. Right? And for those of you who believe in it, act and you'll be in heaven. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite Mrs. Padmakshi Vaidya to present a potted plant and mementos at